thanks very much for the introduction. Natural resource economics has, as a discipline, has matured over recent times, and it's given governments a recognition that in fiscal policy, central banks can play a major economic role, issuing of bonds, buying debt, or printing money, have given governments much greater flexibility in allocating public funding, and we've touched on that earlier today. Private banks have also been provided money and allowed to leverage up to about 100-fold, giving more options for expenditure on natural resource management. Modern monetary theory provides a rationalisation for this Keynesian increased supply of money and ways to control inflation. This has led to 3 recent studies on how to maintain and recover biodiversity in the process, describing how perverse government subsidies for exploiting natural resources have led to our current parlous state of the natural world. And these are the 3 studies. I'm not very tech savvy, and I wasn't able to transfer them from my PDF into a slide. Oh, I've got to be talking here, so sorry, folks. There's the first one, Managing Nature, Closing the Global Biodiversity Financing Gap, last year from the Paulson Institute, the Nature Conservancy, Cornell Atkinson Centre for Sustainability, and it's a 220-page document that goes into the financing of natural resources and biodiversity in some detail, as you would imagine. This is the Dasgupta review, which came out, I think, in February this year from the Treasury. UK Treasury asked Emeritus Professor Dasgupta to review the economics of biodiversity, and that review is again very, very comprehensive and basically, and the third one, sorry, is this one, which is the Ecological Society of America, Innovative Finance for Conservation, Roles for Ecologists and Practitioners. And it's again gives detail, particularly from an American point of view, on how to get funding and organise funding to make sure that these public goods are maintained. Can I have the first? Do I do slides still? Oh, sorry. I'm certainly, and of course my slides show that I've well and truly lost the art of how to make slides. So you'll have to forgive me on that one, and I didn't have any students to help me. So. Right. Where about now? So do I do it, or you can?
No, you can do it. It's just not working.
I don't want anything on the side. That's full screen. That's great. So this is looking at the Dasgupta review, UK, and as you can see, the nature is an asset, which we've been talking about all morning. If we don't. Sustainability, as Greg mentioned, is key, a key word, and if we don't look to that, we're endangering everyone's future prosperity. There's institutional failure in subsidies, as I've mentioned. The figure of $4 to $6 trillion per annum is an enormous amount of money through these exploiting natural resources through subsidies. Economies are embedded in nature, well, we're well across that. Choosing a sustainable path requires transformative change, and this is, in a sense, the theme of what my recent studies in this area have been about, how to bring about this transformative change in culture that enables the kind of public spending to leverage private spending. Remember that generally speaking, government spending somewhere between 24 and 30% of the GDP, or maybe even more in some of the Scandinavian countries. But we really need something akin to the Marshall Plan. And as I mentioned in my introduction, the way that monetary policy, fiscal policy has been changed over the recent times, with the banks buying bonds and allowing credit to be created for fiscal management by governments, gives us an opportunity to go back to the Marshall Plan, which was, of course, a money printing exercise by the United States. And the United States has always done this from Roosevelt on. And of course, we go through the farce of having to allow the budget deficit to be expanded yet again and so on as they present their annual budgets, or when it runs out or they're running into the debt ceiling. But the United States and Japan haven't fallen apart, and they've got rather large deficits that are supposedly on the books. So the Marshall Plan, and I mentioned earlier in one of my comments that Australia went down this path after the Second World War, the 3 Cs, managed Australian economy rather well, and recognition that any development of the land in Australia would require public funding, and they did. We've dropped off that with the neoliberal change in economic thinking in recent times since Friedman and our Austrian friend. We're coming back from that, I think. I think that the recognition that Australian Central Bank can print bonds and cover the debts that we've gone into without any hassle in this COVID stimulus that we've been through. So at last, I think it's getting through to at least some people in our governing fraternity that we don't manage government fiscal policy like a household debt. We manage it as a public good to keep people employed and to manage inflation. And there are levers for that. Last thing, the urbanisation disconnect. I'm anxious about that because we're becoming more and more urbanised the world over. As people lose contact with the ground, their own ground, they touch, they look at trees, they get connected, and their sense of being in the world gets lost. So that's an issue. That's a cultural issue that we're facing now, and I'm not sure how we address it, but I think we have to the kinds of things we've been talking about, the regenerative agriculture and so on, are part of that dialogue to change the culture, certainly in the producing communities, the agricultural communities, but we need something in the cities. When I was studying for my PhD, the Australian biological societies changed the curriculum for teaching in Australia. They deliberately went out and worked on a project over 2 or 3 years. I believe that that led to the city allowing governments to set up the land care movement and to sponsor the land care movement. It's a city-led movement, even though it's actuated in the country. But it wouldn't happen without some credibility and acceptance from the community. So that's culture change. Next slide. How do we, oh God, sorry. I'll leave you to do it, I'll just say next slide. Where are we up to? So this is the second one of those, the American-based one. Government action, private sector critical, of course. Appropriate, as Greg has been talking about, appropriate valuation of nature. This is an interesting one, the finance gap to bring biodiversity up to a reasonable standard and to help encourage its resilience. That's the sort of money, 2% of the GDP. At the moment, we're about half that worldwide. So that's the kind of effort that's needed monetarily. We've been talking about economic support for farmers in various guises, particularly for ecosystem services, and to recognise that they manage them, and that the investment. We've had a bit of a dialogue at morning tea about banks and how they're not coming on board yet necessarily, but they've certainly got to, the investment community's got to realise that climate change is going to come in the main through nature-based resources. We're going to pull out carbon from the atmosphere through chemical means, but that's a long way off yet to be in any sense going to change the carbon dioxide story, climate change story. Avoid infrastructure development in critical habitats. There's obviously a dialogue that I've had a little bit of a part in coal seam gas and coal mining and destruction of good agricultural land and land planning not actually working in this space. It's a bit of a tragedy because you can't recover that land. Once it's gone, once the wells have broken through the hydrology into the future, we're not going to restore those aquifers. And that's why the Condamine irrigators were a bit worried. Let's go to the next one. Oh, this is the last one. There is a UN convention, of course, and this year is their meeting, and we need a national plan, finance plan, to bring it up to that 2% GDP, which we're not anywhere near at the moment. Next one. So UK, we've heard about the Agriculture Bill and the Environment Bill in the UK. This has been a trigger from Brexit to say, well, okay, the CAP of the European Union doesn't exist anymore. The farmers were getting 80% of their £3.5 billion annual subsidy from the Common Agricultural Programme, the CAP. So the Brits are taking quite an encouraging approach, and I've been really quite taken with what they've tried to do in both those bills. So farmers to take action and get paid for that rather than the outcome. So it's not outcome delivery per se. Pay for delivery of tree planting, flood mitigation, habitat creation, restoration of management of the habitat. Then we move into the next level, which I've also mentioned this morning, which is the landscape level. The landscape level and transforming that. So the first two tiers are of an individual farm operation, but then there is money and processes for looking at the transformational change in a catchment basis, and organisations are paid to do that, to manage that. And then there's an existing stewardship scheme that was set up under the before Brexit, and it's reasonably extensive, 530,000 hectares with 10-year PES contracts already in existence. So that is the services that are arable land conversion, the 4 to 5 metres around cropped areas, etc. Is interesting. It's the recovery of the hedges that were allowed to be mowed out, ploughed out, and hopefully it will bring the biodiversity and wildlife back through that, and probably also along with some shrubs that we might get hedges re-established, etc. Perhaps I can actually look at my own notes rather than the screen, and I apologise because I'm going away from the audience. The New Deal, Roosevelt realised with the 30s that they had to, 1930s, that they had to combat the Dust Bowl. And so that meant taking land out of production, which what was the agricultural adjustment was about. And put money into conservation programs under Title II. And so that led to the current US Stewardship Reserve Soil Health funding going into 190 million hectares. So it's extensive, and that's built on from the New Deal up to that level. There are particular programs, and I'll show a next slide. We won't go through it, but just to show you the multiplicity of the 8 sub-programs that operate out of the stewardship and reserve programs, and that's 10 billion per annum across 25 million hectares. So it's quite extensive. And the 8th will come to the governance and level of funding from landholding to catchment, various systems that operate under the stewardship and reserve program. Another program in the US is the American Prairie Reserve, where NGOs led by the Nature Conservancy and WWF established in 1924 public corridors, bought land to connect corridors, to allow corridor connection between the protected areas in the prairies. 1.2 million hectares is involved, and they've got over $100 million assets to spend on maintenance of that reserve. It's been a real success story, and it's recovery of the biodiversity. Of course, it's got tourism and so on, but that's the kind of private-public partnership, the NGOs and the public protected areas working together. Similar one in Saskatchewan, which tried to recover or to maintain or to stop from being lost to agricultural production of a tillage kind, the 30-odd million hectares of the prairie. And they have now 3.3 million hectares with 31 partners working to maintain the prairies in Canada.
Might just give you a timing call there, Peter.
I could finish now, but I was constrained by Philippa to not talk about China and EU and Costa Rica, but we do talk about that in a paper that we've prepared that we hope to get published in the Proceedings of the Royal Society, and they have interesting stories to tell in this space as well. That just current slide gives an indication of those 8 programs that come out of the USDA conservation initiative. So they break down their gross spending, I think I said $10 billion per annum, into these various sub-programs, and they have their rules on how to manage, but they go from auctions, like the reverse auctions in the Australian carbon credit system, to various direct payments for the services rendered. Stop. Anyone wants to talk to me about China? And I've got slides, but we won't go through them. The EU and Costa Rica. China has a huge program, and it's Xi has called it the progress towards